You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Well, hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole, and I'm just so excited to be here. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I guess I feel fine about it. And with me to celebrate is none other than Zachary Fruhling.
Matt, always a pleasure. Let's drill this hole and drop this nuke. What do you say?
Sounds like a plan to me. I mean, it should. What could possibly go wrong?
In space on an asteroid?
Nothing. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm excited to talk about this one. It's been a long time since I've seen this movie, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. Before we dive into everything, just wanted to say thank you to all that are listening. Please, wherever you're listening to this, just make sure you subscribe and you'll get the shows as soon as they drop. You can also find us all over social media. We're on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. We're also on whatever they call Twitter these days at the 602 Club. Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We've got the entire network at Trek.fm where you can see all of the shows that are happening. And of course, you can check the listeners only discussion group there on Facebook called the Babel Conference. You can join. And you can go over to Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of the team and make sure all of these great podcasts keep coming to you each and every week. So before we even got into anything else, I remember back to these 2 years. So this came out in 1998, and the previous year in 1997, we had also had Hollywood produce 2 films of the same disaster genre. So the previous year had 2 volcano movies with Dante's Peak and then Volcano, and then in 1998, we had 2 asteroid movies with Armageddon and Deep Impact. And really interesting, too, is that a production president at Disney had basically taken notes on everything for Deep Impact, and then they decided they were going to do their own with Armageddon because Touchstone was a subsidiary of Disney. And so I just think it's fascinating to me the way Hollywood works, and that 2 years in a row, we would have 2 competing movies about the same type of disasters, trying to see who can do it better.
What do you think about this Hollywood one-upmanship? It kind of reminds me of maybe like the fast food wars of the 90s. Like, McDonald's has a triple cheeseburger, so Burger King has to have a triple cheeseburger. Does that lead to better movies that just because it's inherently one-upmanship, everyone's trying to one-up everyone else? Does the competition help, or is it too much copycat and not enough originality?
Well, I was wondering if the thing about this was it reminds me, like, I think you bring up, like, the fast food wars. I think of, obviously, Pepsi and Coke. It felt like everything in the 80s and the 90s, we were having these dichotomies, right? You either liked Burger King or you either liked McDonald's. You were either a Coke person or you were a Pepsi person. And then, you had them trying to do clear Pepsi and new Coke. And you've got all these things happening. So yeah, it makes sense to me in some ways that Hollywood would try to do the same thing. Hollywood has definitely always been, I think, about if something's successful, we'll try to copy it.
Has Hollywood ever had the kind of brand loyalty that, say, Coca-Cola had? Are there Paramount fans and MGM fans? And I never thought of movies that way, where companies would be trying to steal each other's market share. Obviously, when a movie comes out, everyone wants, the companies want people to see that movie. But is there a kind of brand loyalty? I don't think of it that way.
Yeah, you actually, it makes me think back to, we talked about Casablanca, which was a Warner Brothers film, and the studio system was such a big deal back then. You had these studios that had signed specific stars, And so the bigger the star you had and the more films you were putting out with that star was kind of, what your box office share might be. So it does seem like, in a lot of ways, it makes sense that these studios would be competing against each other like this. And I feel like the late 90s and early 2000s were just rife with disaster movies anyway. I mean, Twister was a big deal back then. I mean, you think of like Day After Tomorrow or something like it. So to find ideas like, okay, we're going to have an asteroid hit the Earth, or we're going to have a volcano explode, makes a lot of sense.
One of the questions I had as I was prepping for our recording today is, what was happening culturally in the 90s where disaster movies became so prominent? Nothing comes immediately to mind other than the fact that technology's improved and we can do these big budget disaster scenes. But why was that so appealing in the 90s? Nothing comes to my mind.
I mean, do you think that it had to do with the fact that, this is before 9/11, and the world has generally, after the fall of the Soviet Union, been relatively peaceful, and so the idea of an external force being what destroys us is something that people are exploring more so than the internal forces of just our everyday world. Like that the end would come not as a result of us, but as a result of an act of God.
Well, there's a latent environmentalist theme to the movie, of course. And it reminded me of, do you remember when William Shatner went to space a few months ago? I think a few months or a year ago. I forget when it was. He said he went to space and he had this terrible feeling of death outside the window. Like, we have this precious blue marble with life on it and everything's amazing. And you look out the window in space and it's death, and there's nothing so special about it. What we have on Earth is what's precious. And this movie, drives that point home, I think, that, we really need to protect what we do have here because it's more fragile than we treat it day to day.
Yeah. I mean, you think of, I love the scene where, Greenpeace is picketing basically outside the oil derrick, and the guy's like, do you know how much diesel it takes to actually run the ship that you're on here to protest? Like, I think the movie does, a great job of kind of pointing out some of the ridiculous hypocrisies in that sense, which is great. But no, I think you're absolutely right that there is very much kind of baked into the film. And I honestly can't remember if I've seen Deep Impact or not. I know I think Dante's Peak. I don't know if I ever saw Volcano. So it's interesting that I've seen like one of the two films. It'd be interesting to kind of go back and compare, contrast, because I know scientifically, I think Deep Impact was supposed to be more scientifically accurate.
I remember almost nothing about Deep Impact. I know I've probably seen it. And what was funny is I didn't really have an attachment to either movie. I barely remembered Armageddon. When I first saw the movie, I believe I was working at Radio Shack in Solano Mall in Fairfield, California in 1998. And it was one of those like big budget movies they would show on the DirecTV system that we were selling. So I know it was on in the background. And I never actually watched the whole movie. I remember the ending of the movie with Bruce Willis sacrificing himself to save his daughter and save the world, and I remember that. But there are huge swaths of this movie I didn't even remember. So I didn't really have an attachment to either movie, but I remember the plot of this one, and I don't remember the plot even of Deep Impact so much.
Yeah, that's interesting. For me, because I was going to ask you that, and I'm glad you went there, because man, this movie was one of those. I mean, I was graduating high school that year and going to go to college. So this came out in the summer between me graduating high school and going into college. And, this is prime time, like Matt being a big fan of the movies and going to as many movies as possible. And, I'm right in the specific place that we need to be to kind of gravitate towards this. It makes me think of, this movie reminds me basically of It's Independence Day with an asteroid instead of aliens. And so all of that together, like this movie hit right at the right spot. In fact, I remember the day it came out, I actually went and saw it with friends on Friday afternoon. And then a bunch of friends of mine wanted to go see it that evening that hadn't gotten to go with us. And so we went, and this is the time when movies would play, like you would start a movie that's this long at like 11:30 at night. And so we went to that showing, and I fell asleep, which is the only time I've fallen asleep in the theater. But it's because I had already seen the movie, and it had no reflection on the film. And of course, by the time the movie's over, it was almost 3:00 in the morning. So, yeah. And not only that, but that year, I went on a hiking trip with our church youth group, and we were driving to Colorado from Dallas, and I think we listened to this song maybe 47 times, the Aerosmith song.
I don't want to
close my eyes. Don't want to miss a thing. Yeah.
Wait, what's the name of the song? I don't want to close my eyes. Don't want to miss a thing.
I think it's Don't Want to Miss a Thing. You're right. And so, but yeah, I mean, just like this movie is ridiculously kind of burned into my psyche because of all of that stuff that wasn't even necessarily just about the movie. I mean, it goes to show what soundtracks can do. So yeah, this movie was an experience for me back in the day.
It's interesting how just a few years of difference can make in your perception of it. Like, so I was just a little older than you. In 1998, I was 20 and, in college, and I wasn't going to see a lot of movies, and I was busy doing other things. And this movie just never landed on my radar, other than, watching it on the TV at work, maybe, between customers. But, so all that is to say, I watched it for the first time in its entirety just a couple days ago. And I was surprised how tedious I found the movie, to be honest. It's a really long movie, first of all, longer than I thought it was.
It is definitely a long movie.
At the end of the first hour of the movie, the entire first act, essentially, I was thinking, wow, we've established these characters to death. It's a large cast of characters. And nothing's really happened yet, and we're an hour into the movie. Like, this is a tediously long movie. I really wish they had tightened it up, to be honest. But I think it kind of suffers from its own weight. It's got a large cast, and everyone needs their scenes. There's a lot of character to establish, a lot of backstory to establish. Big stuff is happening, and I found the second third, and even all the way to the end of the movie, the third. I found the last 2/3 of the movie remarkably riveting and touching, even in places. I just wish they'd tightened up that first act so much. It was just such a slog.
I got a question then, because I feel like the emotional weight pays off because of all the setup. You're getting to know the characters and you're spending time with them. You're getting to know their stories because you're actually seeing their stories play out there. Do you feel like you would have cared as much if you hadn't have actually spent that time with them?
Yeah, I think probably they could have pared down the cast, to be honest. I think, how many A-list stars are there in this in this movie? There's a ton, right? I probably would have, if I were making the movie, I probably would have slimmed the cast down a little bit, focused even more on the father-daughter relationship. I would have focused even more on the antagonism between Bruce Willis's character and Ben Affleck's character. And then, honestly, a lot of the middle of the movie, even though it was riveting, it wasn't what I found interesting. Like, you asked a couple questions in the notes for today, like, how would people respond to this kind of situation? And the movie doesn't spend much time at all talking about how the world as a whole would respond. It also has this interesting, I don't know quite how to put this, but the name of the movie is Armageddon, which of course is a biblical reference. And, in the late 90s, we see the rise of the religious right. And I wonder how much of the spin on the movie is informed by this rise of the religious right that's going on in the late 90s as well. They refer to the Bible a couple of times. The president refers to the Bible in the movie. But I just think the movie didn't focus on the things I would have found interesting about that situation, the sort of cultural context and how people as a whole would respond, and instead we get this running series of jokes through the first hour of the movie of this cast of roughneck characters we've got.
I think I can see what you're saying. I think that on the idea of like there being a bunch of A-list cast members, it's interesting because back then a lot of these people aren't A-list characters.
Yeah.
I mean, Ben Affleck had, I think, just been in and maybe won his Oscar for writing with Matt Damon for Good Will Hunting.
I'd forgotten Jason Isaacs was in this completely.
Yeah, I mean, this is before Jason Isaacs is huge. This is before, Owen Wilson really hits it big. This is before all of those things. And so, the biggest cast member, and of course, this is before Lord of the Rings. So, Liv Tyler has been somebody who's, around and been in films and everything, but I think she was just kind of starting to hit her peak at this point. And, so the biggest people are Billy Bob Thornton, really, and, of course, Bruce Willis. And so, but just on the length, I think you probably could have shortened this movie a little bit. You probably could have tightened some things up. There are some scenes I don't think that necessarily need to be there, but I would say for me on a whole, the thing that I found rewatching this is that when it came to the cast themselves, I think what actually sells the movie to me is that they found people who could inhabit all of these characters to make them feel real. Even though we might not, whether it's Will Patton's character Chick or, by creating this really funny character with Michael Clark Duncan, Ken Campbell playing Max, you have all of these people, right, that have kind of been around a film for a while, or you may have seen, but they create a character just by their presence. And I think that's, to me, the thing that's actually maybe the strongest part of this film is that the cast sells the movie. And without them, I feel like I would not like this movie as much because these people make a character to which I can immediately buy into. Whereas I don't know if, you hadn't had these specific people in these roles, if I would even cared at all.
What I think the actors portrayed well, I don't know if you ever spent any time doing any manual labor or anything, but if you do construction or if you're an electrician or a plumber, fill in the blank, any kind of hands-on work, especially if there's some specialized knowledge involved, you end up with people drawn to those roles that really have no filter in some way. These characters have no filter whatsoever. Anything they say, whatever comes to their mind, they're going to say it, and they're going to say it in their own way. But what I really appreciated, I don't know if you saw this in the notes, but I appreciated the way in which specialized knowledge was portrayed. This is a very specialized trade, drilling for oil, and lo and behold, that specialized knowledge saves the world. And I teach higher education, so I want to turn people into philosophers and English majors, right? But we need people to do these specialized roles that make the world function. And here's a great example of some highly specialized skill saving the world. So I thought the portrayal of the characters that are drawn to those kinds of careers was not spot on. It was still a caricature, but it was in the right vein.
Yeah, it's just I think. Again, like you get a character like a Steve Buscemi, playing the whacked out rock hound, he's so good at selling that type of role that you immediately kind of understand who this person is because they've cast people that feel very close to who they're playing in some ways. Ben Affleck playing AJ, what we knew of him at that point was Good Will Hunting, and he's a Boston boy, and so to kind of play this rough around the edges person makes complete sense. And I think those are all the things. And then, of course, Bruce Willis basically being a conglomeration of so many of his different types of performances put into this character is fantastic. And so that's the thing that I came away from this movie, this rewatch, because again, it's been years since I've seen this film, just being surprised at how well the casting actually works for the film.
They all gelled well together, for sure. Absolutely. They were a really fun ensemble cast. I just, I would have made it 15 minutes, not an hour of it.
Yeah. And so, I think I'm somewhere, in the middle on that. I think, with the film and its length, I probably would have cut maybe good 10 minutes out of it. And I found there were places you could have really tightened some things up. Even at the ending, I think that there were some ways that you could have done that. This is definitely a film, I think, where, you're showing off a lot of the stuff you can do with the effects. At this point, you had you have things like this, like The Matrix and Phantom Menace are going to come out the next year. And so this was really kind of pushing the effects work and what you could do at that point. And that's like right at the cusp of that revolution that's about to happen.
Yeah, it's easy to, we tend to look at these films in isolation to some extent, judging them on their own merits. But, each of these films is a link in the chain on the way to what movies are like now. And, without this film, you wouldn't have, I don't know. I don't know a lot about the careers of these folks, but I was looking through the writing credits and the directing credits. Like, oh, Michael Bay. Oh, well, you wouldn't have some of the later stuff that he did if you didn't have this, and you wouldn't have the stuff J.J. Abrams did if you didn't have this, and so on and so forth. And so this movie just it feels like a link in the chain, not a particularly interesting link in its own right for me. I like the emotional impact of the movie, but the movie didn't really resonate with me so much. And I didn't really have any attachment with it. But it does strike me that it's an important link in the chain that's maybe a little underappreciated from the development of what we think of as big budget films nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's one of the things that watching the film, I was struck by how when you watch it through the lens of what we have now, obviously things are much different when it comes to the effects. And you can absolutely see, the places where they're trying to marry CGI effects as well as practical elements. And, it's not perfect, but it's interesting to me the places where I feel like it really does stand up. And then there are places where it doesn't quite stand up. I think, the scene specifically that really kind of stood out to me was, when we had the asteroids, hitting New York. And I actually liked this. They made a reference to that the asteroid shower is hitting from New York all the way to Norway. So it's this portion of the Earth that's kind of being affected. So it's like it wasn't just, oh, why is it only hitting New York? It gave you kind of a reason for that happening. But the effects work is something to which, as you're watching buildings fall in New York and stuff, the realization of how not real that looks now all comes from the fact of our lived experience of actually having seen buildings fall in New York and realizing that it doesn't look anything like this. It's much more terrifying, and it's much more destructive than they even make it here, which is interesting that a movie where you're normally so over the top doesn't actually get the amount of destruction it would be like if you cut off half of the Chrysler building and it fell. This is not what it would look like.
No, I vividly remember, of course, like everyone our age, I vividly remember September 11th and what it actually looked like. And, I wasn't there. I was in upstate New York, oddly enough, so I was close enough where I paid a lot of attention. But, yeah, I speaking of the special effects in the movie, there are some scenes that look remarkably good to me, like the scenes you described, the New York scenes. I thought, even though they weren't accurate in what it would actually look like, I thought they were remarkably well done and smooth and looked great. And there are other scenes in the movie that were just obviously like, oh, this is just plain up straightforward green screen. There's cool stuff in the background and then there's some stuff in the foreground and it doesn't blend together very well. But I think you're right. The movie's right on the cusp of what CGI could do. So it doesn't have the coherence of like even something immediately after like Lord of the Rings with its very coherent
exactly.
CGI.
Yeah. Well, and again, you think about the fact that those movies are, you've got the Lord of the Rings, you've got the Matrix, you've got the Phantom Menace. All of these films are going to completely, like, those companies are working on the technology that's going to change what we know of film forever. And so, yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. And I wanted to, we talked a little bit, but the idea of the end of the world as we know it and how this, situation there is completely different than it is now. And I was brought back to the fact, where technology is completely different. And so it would be so much easier at that time period to keep things quiet. And until you let people know what's happening, like they said, there are only 9 telescopes that are under that could see what was coming at that point, and all of them except for one is under their control. And so, unless it gets leaked somehow, like nobody's going to know. And I thought that was really interesting because it gave us a look at the world where we didn't see every single thing happening in every single part of the world at every single moment of every single day. And in all honesty, there's a part of me that was like, man, I feel like the world was a better place when we didn't know every single possible thing. Well, it comes down to more of the I thought process to me. It's not just that ignorance is bliss. It's that by not knowing everything about everywhere all at once, everything everywhere all at once, I'm able then to focus on the here, the now, the local. And isn't that the better thing anyway? Because that's all I can really impact in the first place. And so this just made me think of that world again. And in some ways, I think we're paying for knowing too much about things we can't actually do anything about. Whereas this world shows us, like when people finally know, like they've got maybe a day, and what better, I mean, you don't see mass hysteria. You just see people like, all right, well, I got a day. I might as well spend it with family, having food, eating, drinking, enjoying life, because it might not last much longer than this.
Your question got me thinking about the many different things that have changed in the world from, that's not that many years, 25 years, 1998 to now. But, we obviously the technology improvements, the sort of steady stream of information. We talked about that. But I think the political world has changed too. We're more polarized politically than we were arguably in 1998, even given the political scandals of that time period. I think the religious situation has changed. It's not so obvious that people would have a religious spin on it nowadays. Some would, some wouldn't. That's just as polarized, more polarized than it was in 1998. I'm just curious how all of that would impact people's reactions. What we see in the film is, people kind of come together. There's no big scandal. There's no big political controversy about it. People go hide in the churches and their homes and their cars and whatever they do in the movie. But it just strikes me that the situation would be far, far different now than it would have been in 1998.
Yeah, it makes me, I think talking about it does make me wonder what would happen now if literally there's an asteroid coming. I don't know, what would people do? Would we freak out and everybody do stupid things, or would people just realize, like,
have one final Dionysian revelry before that?
Yeah,
before the end of the world?
Or is it more, or would people more be like, okay, all I've got left is the people that are next to me, and like it would any, like, I don't know, is any of that stuff worth it? What would looting do for you? That you would have a pair of Jordans for 3 hours, right? Or would you rather just spend that time with your friends and family, because that's what really matters in the world, would people realize that things don't matter? It's only people, that's a great question. And I don't know it, because I do think that we do live in a world that seems so utterly lost as to what you mentioned, like the spiritual aspect of it.
I think we want it both ways. We want a deep sense of meaning and purpose, and for some people that's religion, for some people that's other things. But there's this kind of latent nihilism that you get with from the Enlightenment on, right? What happens if there is no God? What happens if there is no deep meaning? What happens if an asteroid takes us out and the entire human race is destroyed tomorrow? How can you not take a nihilistic spin on that, right? What did it all mean? How could it mean anything significant if it's that simple? So we kind of want it both ways. We want meaning and we want purpose and we want connection. We want something bigger than ourselves. But the reality is we live on this tiny little, island of an oasis, in this vast sea of nothingness, as far as we know as of today. So, which is it? Should we take the more nihilistic route, or do we go, huddle with each other and pray in churches? Which way do we go? Which way do we go? And what's the best approach?
I think that's actually something that would end up happening, and I think just to kind of, I mentioned the idea of our thoughts about like 9/11 and how that of course changes the reality of what we look like, what things look like, what things of this film even look like, and what our thought process would be about that. To me, I think one of the things that brings to mind is that, when 9/11 happened, I think what we saw was a resurgence of people, finding faith again, right? Because of the thought process of, okay, this is it, and so I think that there actually might be something to that. With the end of the world as we know it, when your push comes to shove, the saying is there's no atheists in foxholes. When the entire world is a foxhole, you really do have to come to grips with, do you really believe there's nothing? And are you really going to stake your life on that when it's going to end in 15 hours or whatever? Or are you going to look for something else? And I think that would have been interesting to see the movie be able to deal with more. But the way the movie does seem to deal with it is that people cling to friends and family and those type of things.
That's incontrovertible.
And that's what they hold
to. Do that, absolutely.
Right. So,
but you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me, there's this passage from one of my favorite philosophers, Nietzsche. He said, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's something like this. Like, way back in some backwoods corner of the universe, there was a star on which clever beasts invented knowing. And it was the most, arrogant, mendacious, moment of world history. But it was just a moment. And eventually the star cooled and congealed and the clever beasts had to die. And so much for human kind and human ambition and human meaning. And this movie takes that kind of approach. I mean, think about it. If the world's going to end tomorrow, it's hard to. We might cling to things. Absolutely, psychologically, we'd cling to things. But how could you realistically say it all mattered when we can blink out of existence that easily? It's hard not to step back and go, maybe nihilism's the right approach.
Yeah, I do think it creates really interesting questions, and I don't know if that's exactly. I don't think I would go towards the nihilism route, just because to believe that all of this is meaningless makes it all meaningless. And I like you said, man's search for meaning is something that's super important.
Well, we're meaning makers. We make our own meaning, even if there isn't any deep meaning, right?
Well, yeah. Well, you can make your own meaning, but that's still meaningless. Like in the end, like if you're following that logic all the way down to its ultimate unpacking, like if you're making up your own meaning, it's still meaningless. So you can cling to something because we as human beings have to. I think the bigger question is, why do we have to? And to me, that's the thing that is most interesting about that question, because I think the reason, the question about why do human beings have to create meaning for themselves, why do they have to have some meaning, is so influential then into how you would actually answer that question. I think it leads us to the fact that meaning is more important than us just like needing it. Like, why do we need it? Well, I think that's a bigger question, and the answer to that question can't just be because we need it.
I thought the president's comments in the movie were at least relevant and particularly interesting. He basically said, think of all the steps and achievements humans have done over time, even the missteps, the wars and the controversies and whatnot. All of those led us right here to this moment, our greatest challenge. And that's it's an incredibly linear way of looking at history, but I like that he said even the missteps brought us here, and those were important too. And we can rise and meet the challenge together because we had the missteps.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is another important thing that the movie does show is that it's true to our reality, right? Like a lot of the things that we had and came up with for NASA had come from like weapons research and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, what we get from NASA and the desire to get to the moon, leads to all these other inventions, right? It's the search for knowing and meaning and something greater that leads us to that. Even the discoveries that from war and all of that, to be able to get to the place where you could do what we do in this movie, which we still can't anyway. Of course, the space shuttles they have and all that stuff is still, I think, a little beyond us, the way they all work. But to realize that, yeah, all of our knowledge can lead us to good places, right? And it's about how we use that knowledge that creates the good and the bad of it. It's the action, and I think that was something that I really liked about the film, because they took all the things that we had learned, even the things that could have been considered bad, put them to the right use. And instead of a negative outcome, we get a positive outcome. We get the saving of the world instead of destruction of the world. And I think that's the thing that really, when you kind of talked about the environmental aspect of the film, it's like, we have the technologies to make our environment cleaner and better. Will we use them? That's the question. And those are still a lot of them are on the table, but we refuse to use them. So, that I love that, because I do think, again, it's a really small part of the film. But there are some great questions there.
Well, we'll use them when there's a need to, probably when there's an actual crisis. So we'll wait too late and then we'll use them. Just like in this movie. I remember I forget the character's title, but the director of NASA, let's call him the director of NASA. I forget his name at the moment, but he tells the president, we've scanned 3% of the sky. This stuff's it's a big sky, and this stuff costs money, and we're under budget here, so we don't have a very, very big budget, so we haven't been able to do our jobs very well.
Well, and that's something that I think the film leads us to something really interesting in the fact that we play out the Star Trek axiom of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And so the fact that we are going to have these willing participants who may or may not be sacrificing their own lives on this one-way trip, which could very easily be a one-way trip for them, to make sure that all can live. Exactly. And, I think there's something about that we as human beings, just like when we're talking about meaning and everything, like, still our greatest stories almost always come down to one person sacrificing for another. And we can't seem to get away from that in our storytelling.
It's a theme that's come up in, even the small number of movies you and I have talked about together. It came up in Braveheart. It came up in Casablanca. It comes up here. There's something universally appealing about that trope.
Well, and I think that the thing that is interesting about that, and where I was kind of going with the idea of meaning, the question as why is that the case, I think is a question to which leads us to answers to which a lot of people don't like, but I think they all come back to that's what C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien would say. They are the mythologies we tell about the true mythology, and calling the story of the Bible true mythology. It's the mythology that's actually true. And every other story we tell has to do with, in some ways, recreating that story in different ways, shapes, and forms. but it can't get away from that story, which all comes down to, right, what? Self-sacrifice.
Well, this isn't necessarily a dichotomy, because I think you could give an interpretation of any given character like this, a hero character, from either perspective. There's the kind of Judeo-Christian lens, which is, self-sacrifice and martyrdom and, lack of hubris and whatnot. But then those very same characters often have these character traits we associate with more of the Greek hero mindset, right? They do have hubris, and they do have overconfidence, and they do want to be heroes, and they do want to be recognized. Like the Russian cosmonaut who's like, I'm not going to be the guy who didn't volunteer. I have to be the brave one. And so which is it? Which set of values is driving those characters? And again, I don't think it's really a dichotomy, but if you're Christian, you're going to go, okay, I'm going to look at it from the martyrdom standpoint. But if you're more of a humanist, you're going to go, God, look at the chutzpah these guys have.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. I just think, again, that does not answer the question as to why we still love stories of self-sacrifice so much. Why they prick us in the heart in a way that no other story does.
I don't know. I think it's... we're social creatures, first of all, so we like people that will sacrifice themselves for the greater good inherently. But there's also an element of, don't we all wish we could be like that? We all wish we could be the hero. We'd like to think we're strong enough to do the right thing in those situations and not just, go be hedonists for our last 12 hours on Earth.
But I think that the very answer to that question is that if it's truly all meaningless, we wouldn't feel like that. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm trying to drive at, is that the reason that we intrinsically, even without thinking, respond to stories of self-sacrifice is because it's ingrained in all of us in a way, because there's a truth to that story that goes beyond anything else. And so you can't get there just by saying that we're social creatures. You can't get there just by saying we're, anything else. Because it doesn't, again, if I begin to unpack all of those things, it doesn't get you to that we would all respond to stories of self-sacrifice. What it gets us to is that if, we're truly just here on our own, it's all meaningless. I wouldn't care about other people. I don't need other people. Other people don't matter. Nothing matters. Mm-hmm. So therefore, these stories I don't think would actually mean anything to us. So it leads me all the way back to, it's like the why. If we're really answering the why, I don't think it can go down a road that's not spiritual. I don't think it can go down a road where there, isn't a story that's true beyond all stories that inspires us to write our own stories.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what the kind of flip side of the coin is. Some sort of evolutionary cultural anthropological standpoint on it. How would the human race have got so far if it weren't the case that we find that appealing? But it's not a very satisfying answer, right? I think probably because it moves us. Fundamentally, I'm a romantic, and so it's like these stories are moving in some 19th century romantic sense. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we want the emotional impact of it, the emotional deep impact of it.
Yeah, I think that the deep impact, as you mentioned, I love that. It's very funny. It's good. I like it. That's perfect. Is because it is not just romantic, right? Because I don't even think romanticism can answer those questions for us.
And these stories have a history long before romanticism, as
exactly,
we know it. Yeah,
absolutely. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing. These stories are so universal and so much bigger than, just one society. It's something that's been happening for so long. I think that's the other thing. There's got to be something more to it, which, again, the fact that we're talking about Armageddon and having this type of
but it's a chicken and an egg problem, right? To some
extent,
extent, these stories are chasing our values. We have these values, and so we write stories in line with these values. On the other hand, these stories they define our values to some extent. These stories are our history, and we respond to them, and that's the reason we have the values we have, because these stories are so ancient.
But I still think that can't quite answer the question, because why we have those values in the first place doesn't come from the stories. You see what I'm saying? Like we still can't get to the crux of the question. Why would we have those values in the first place if nothing has any meaning? But human beings can't get away from the idea that there is meaning, there is value, and that something has value. We literally
I guess
can't.
To some extent, that's my point. The nihilism of this movie
like
is that's not the norm in human history, right? The human history is full of meaningfulness and storytelling and values, and right. And it's only in the last couple hundred years that we can tell a nihilistic interpretation of a story like this.
Right. Because, and the reason is because nobody can actually live as a nihilist. Regardless of whether you'd want to or not. If you did, you would just blow your brains out, because you would realize there's no meaning. Guess, right? Yeah, exactly. But that's my point. It's like we don't have the ability as human beings to live like that, because we have to have meaning. If we truly believed that there was no meaning, we would just lay down and die, because we can't live like that. And I think that because we're not wired to. I think it's because we're not created to. And I think that's the interesting thing about this film, strangely enough, is to be able to kind of like think about those type of things, because this movie does paint a picture of like, what would you do if the end was coming?
Yeah, and I gotta say, as much as I've been criticizing the movie, I really was not a fan of the first hour of the movie or so. But I thought the middle part of the movie was remarkably compelling, and I thought the emotional impact was still a punch in the gut at the end of the movie, and it was remarkably effective at those things. I just wish those would have been a little more of the focus. But
yeah. I mean, so, and I'm glad that you were able to kind of get to that place by the end of the film. And, I find the same thing. I do think that there is a way in which the movie is able to kind of find a place in moving me, because of the fact that we spent enough time with the characters so that I would care about them. And, I wanted to ask you, this was one of those things where a movie had a soundtrack that went beyond just the film. As I mentioned, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing. We listened to that a trillion times on the way to and from Colorado.
Right.
Yeah. And so, how did you feel about the way in which, the music plays such a big part in not only defining scenes, but defining characters with the type of music that they're listening to? Did all of that work for you? Does it still work for you, even though we're so removed from the soundtrack by this point?
I think it does, because I've known people like this. I know people in specialized jobs, and I've done manual labor, and you always have the rock and roll soundtrack. If you got to build a house, you put the rock and roll on, you build the damn house, right? And so, obviously you can't have a classical score with a movie like this, not with these characters, right? You got to have the rock and roll soundtrack. On the other hand, there were parts of it that I think were really cheesy. It's like, okay, Liv Tyler's in the movie, so of course there's going to be a couple of Aerosmith songs in the movie, and sure, that works. I mean, yeah, again, the music's so good, it doesn't bother me at all. I mean, the music's amazing. I mean, that's an amazing Aerosmith song, and I even really liked the Aerosmith's version of "Come Together" by the Beatles. That was great. I'd forgotten that was in the movie. That was and really well done, well placed in the movie, actually. So I thought the soundtrack actually helped, but again, it's not a deep soundtrack; it's a rock and roll soundtrack to the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the soundtrack still works. I think it still definitely holds up. I liked it a lot.
These are classics, yeah, because they're going to hold up forever. 100 years, they're going to hold up.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, the soundtrack has a bunch of things where you got some people covering old songs as well, which I enjoyed. And yeah, I think they do a really good job with picking the songs.
I enjoyed the leaving on a jet plane shtick. When they're getting ready to suit up and blast off.
And I think Trevor Rabin, who does the actual score, I think he was able to create a score that kind of made me feel a little bit like, you get the right stuff kind of feel from it, like it kind of gives you that or like a Top Gun type feel, which is what you want, where it's like, it's very, it's like patriotic without using a patriotic theme.
I'm glad you mentioned Top Gun. I know we're talking about the music, but I'm glad you mentioned Top Gun, because as I was thinking of the scenes in the movie that I really enjoyed, one of the scenes I enjoyed was the crazy, we're going to take the Armadillo vehicle and we're going to jump over the canyon, which is a ridiculously crazy idea. It reminds me of just a minute ago while we were talking about it, I was thinking about that scene in Top Gun when Maverick says, I'm gonna hit the brakes and he'll fly right by, and this Rio goes, what? You're gonna do what? Mm-hmm. So you're gonna do what? You get this crazy idea, and I love the lone hero aspect of the movie, and it's an ensemble cast, but they all get to be heroes in their own way. So it's a bunch of lone heroes put together, and lone heroes can get away with crazy stuff, and they have crazy ideas, and they see it through, and whether it's drilling 800 feet or launching or driving the Armadillo over the canyon, lone heroes can get away with this kind of stuff, and we cheer them on. It's supposed to be wildly entertaining to see that happen.
No, I agree, and I think giving you that type of over the topness is absolutely,
and the music helps. The music drives all that home.
Yeah. Yes, 100% agree with you. Well, I'm interested because with everything that we've talked about, and knowing that you weren't a huge fan of the beginning of the film, but it seems like you were able to kind of come around with it. Where do you land with your ratings for Armageddon?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I said, I would seriously have tightened up the beginning of the movie, and a lot of the humor, I get it. I understand people who work in those roles, and I see what they were going for. I would have trimmed it a lot. I thought the middle of the movie was remarkably just compelling and entertaining and riveting. It was an action movie, and I enjoyed it. And I thought the punch at the end of Bruce Willis sacrificing himself for his daughter and for the world was emotionally compelling. But still, it's never going to be one of my favorite movies. I rented the movie. I didn't buy the movie, for example, to watch it. I don't feel like I need to watch it anytime in the next 20 years, probably. So I'm still going to have to give it kind of a lower rating, even than those comments justify. Let's give it 3.5 out of 5 Russian cosmonauts.
Nice. It's really funny because we're actually at the same rating. I'm at a 3.5 out of 5, 3.5 out of 5 armadillo jumps because, I think the movie is above average. I think it's fun, and I think it knows exactly what it is, which is, I think, the thing that makes the movie enjoyable, because it's not trying to be anything else other than an outlandishly crazy movie.
And it's conscious of it.
I think,
it's
exactly. Absolutely. I think you're 100% right on that. And I think the thing that really makes this work is that the cast is able to bring out things in this film to where you feel for each of these characters enough so that when they do die or when they survive, you're thankful, you like it, you're glad, or, you're feeling it. And so I think that's all really successful. And the fact that you can just sit back and enjoy this movie in the same way that, I can pop in Independence Day the same way. Now, I think Independence Day is a better movie than this.
Now, I've watched that movie 100 times. I'd probably watch it 100 more and still be happy with it in contrast to this movie.
Yeah, and so that's where I think that movie gets like a whole half star more, which puts in a whole other echelon of films for me than this one. And I don't own this movie. I watched it on Max because it was streaming there. It was great. I didn't have to pay for it. I did pay for it, but you know what I mean. But it's a movie that, like, if it's on streaming, I might watch it again, sometime. So I think that's that.
I should say, but I don't want to neglect this comment. I did actually cry at the end of the movie. It's a very touching end of the movie, and I neglected to say I really was, like you probably were. Anyone who feels is going to be impacted by this movie, and so I didn't give that enough credit.
No, I'm right there with you, man. I think they do a great job of that. I think the beauty of that too is you have the father-son relationship between AJ and Bruce Willis's character. You know, you've got the father-daughter relationship going on there, and all of those things together create this very heartening moment, you know, where he's basically like, you've got more to live for. Go take care of my daughter now. And you're basically the son I never had. And that's everything AJ's really wanted to hear. And
it's remarkably forward-looking, you know? I mean, you know, yes. Bruce Willis isn't old, but he's older than either of the other two characters that you mentioned. And, you know, what do you do? And why else would you be a parent except to drive the human race forward and look to the future, right? So it's a very forward-looking movie, even given the latent nihilism of it. Yeah,
I liked it. So, you know, I'm glad it's so much fun to go back to a film like this and talk about it. And I'm excited to be able to come back with you. We're going to do that with another film coming up here soon that I haven't seen in a while, but The Prestige. So I think that's going to be a great conversation. But, you know, Zach, if people wanted to catch up with you and see what else you've got going on these days, where would they find you?
Yeah, there's two good places. You can find me on the app formerly known as Twitter. My handle is just my name, @Zachary Fruhling. Also, you're welcome to find me on my philosophy blog, just ZacharyFruhling.com. I tend to write about a bunch of academic topics in philosophy, but I also occasionally write about philosophy and film as well.
Awesome. And, of course, you can find me all over social media, MattRushing02. Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero are the places I'm most active. You can also, of course, find me here on the network outside the 602 Club with Literary Treks, The Orb, Warp 5, Saddle Up, and The Artificial Tango. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, you'll find me with a completed show called Owl Post with Drea Kaufman, talking about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series. And then I'm on Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. But thank you so much for joining us. And y'all come back now, you hear?